Kicking off another meeting of the massively fun SIG CMS Kubernetes focus group that we've been working on with Drupal a little bit. I think that some of the motivation for creating this group is specifically to talk about some of the challenges that we face with hosting CMSs like Drupal on Kubernetes. It's definitely a mental shift to move from traditional hosting to understanding how to take something that is meant to be a little bit more stateful and put it into the Kubernetes world. It's got its fair share of challenges. We have a pretty strong community in the Drupal space, and I think are looking at ways of taking what we're working on and taking what we're understanding to the broader world in some capacity. There's a lot of lessons that, for example, the WordPress community or the Typo 3 community or the Symfony community might be able to appreciate as a result of going through understanding the benefits of Kubernetes and what that has to offer. So that's generally why we get together. There is a GitHub resource page that everybody can go to kind of see the latest updates with the SIG, and that is github.com/drud/SIG-CMS, SIG-CMS to be specific. And we also have a little bit of interest in a conversation that happens on a regular basis in the Drupal.org Slack channels. So if you have a chance to join us and pound Kubernetes in the Drupal.org Slack channel, that's a great way of talking to us as well. Today, we have a little bit of a small group, but that's fine. We're recording this for posterity, and it should hopefully elicit a little bit of conversation. I know one of the things that we've been trying to understand, we've surfaced a lot of different pieces of advice, some simple questions and answer types of sessions have happened in this conversation previously. But in off-channel conversations, we basically are starting to come up with maybe a little bit more focus for this group and want to rely on a lot of the learnings that we get from the Kubernetes community as far as how to manage these groups, how to make these groups as applicable as possible to a broad range of interests and to a broad range of people. I don't want to kind of give away too much, but we've got a pretty fantastic set of proposals that I think are coming out. Shawn Stratton is going to walk us through those a little bit and share some of his ideas that he has for possibly unifying some of the effort that we put into this group. So interested in hearing those. Normally we start off with a quick round of introductions, but the people that are on this call are fairly familiar. They've all been on previous calls before. So I think we can go ahead and skip that part. And Shawn, if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen, I assume that there's, yeah, cool. So if you don't mind, I'll hand the mic over to you and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yep, so I'm Shawn Stratton. This presentation will be actually fairly fast. I usually present to a group that's more communicative, so the fact that we have a small room today is actually kind of a negative. But in general, I just want to do a quick introduction, just so there's some ground as to why I'm making the proposal. I've been a PHP developer technically since the late 90s, but the first major work was in 2001. I worked as a PHP developer primarily until 2012, at which point I switched over to operations. I've worked for several large companies, and I've run custom CMSs for companies like Discovery Channel, for example. I've been working with Kubernetes since 2016, and I understand some of the challenges that come to deploying off-the-shelf solutions to new container platforms, or even in the past, I still remember how daunting it was to deploy WordPress originally to Amazon Web Services back when EC2 was still kind of new and RDS wasn't really a thing. So why am I talking today? Back in November, we had an on-site where I had an opportunity to be part of the group. And during the on-site, I I noticed that, while we were discussing issues in general, there wasn't really a big driving force behind the SIG itself. There weren't, for example, actionable items coming out of that meeting. There weren't things to focus, effort towards a attainable goal. So that was kind of my drive. And after the meeting, I talked to Kevin, and as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. So I felt it was, probably fair that I actually present these to the group rather than just, tell them to Kevin and let Kevin worry about the actual proposals and so forth and so on. So as part of the presentation, I did some research, and this is a little bit subjective because unfortunately there isn't really an objective list of these are the top 5 or top 10 CMS projects. The problem really is, even as Kevin introduced at the beginning, there isn't really a good definition of CMS out there, because if at the base of it, a shopping cart's a CMS, or a framework could be considered a CMS. So I created a list of what I consider the top 5 current CMSs out there. To me, that's more like blog platforms and static website platforms, things of that nature. My list at the moment is WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, Typo3, and a JavaScript library called Ghost. But even within that, it was really difficult to kind of narrow it down. But the current landscape of those 5, it brought some interesting challenges for the Kubernetes community, or specifically for the CMS community on Kubernetes. Out of the list I just gave, out of those 5, only 4 or only one of them actually had its own official Docker image out and about that wasn't managed by the Docker community, for example. Surprisingly enough, it was actually the smallest out of the bunch. It was Typo3 that has their own official Docker image. WordPress's Docker image, Ghost Docker image, they're all handled by Docker community. So they're Docker official when you go to the Docker registry, for example. They will be marked as official images, but they're not necessarily guided by the community that's behind the software running on them. Further, none of the projects themselves offered any form of Kubernetes deployment manifests or Helm charts or any tools like that. Now, there's a third-party company named Bitnami that does actually provide Helm charts for 4 out of the 5. They currently provide Helm charts for WordPress, Ghost, Drupal, Joomla, and a ton of other software out there. But again, it's not close to the CMS group itself. It's not close to that community. It's not managed by that community. But the real surprise I got was when I was actually looking through the documentation on WordPress or looking through the documentation on Drupal. None of them actually had any active sections of, hey, this is how you run our software on this platform. Now, in fairness, they didn't really have a lot on cloud platforms either, but at the same time, imagine coming in as a new developer and finding that there's no documentation of how to run it in today's technology. I also found a couple of long-running tickets for functionality, especially in WordPress, that they've been out there. The requests have been, in the case of the one I found on WordPress, for example, to add environmental support to some function. I don't even recall. But the point being is, the requesting has been out there since 2017. Nobody's really actively focused on that work. So it almost feels like, like the Kubernetes community is too new for these projects to really take seriously. And then the final one, as somebody who's advocated and worked in containers for a while, the standard application architecture is what's known as 12-factor. Now, that's a good guideline for how to write applications that deploy in containers. It's not necessarily the best, but at the same time, it kind of gives some of the underlying requirements that we have. So for example, you don't write to the local file system. Each application is treated as stateless. You use environment for your configuration, etc. And none of these CMSs support, even the basic outputs of that. So those are all challenges. Now, as developers, we can easily rectify those situations when we work on the CMSs ourselves. We're familiar with the systems, we're familiar with our limitations. And I mean, for the most part, there are mostly plugins to handle most of these issues, or minor hacks or little things that we can do. But the challenge still exists. I mean, as a new developer coming in, let's say I knew nothing about WordPress, and today I got the Kevin came down from Mount High and said, hey, you must deploy WordPress to our production instance, our production cluster. Where would I come to find that information? Where do I really look? Now, obviously the community has stepped up significantly. There are tons of blogs about every single one of these, these CMS systems out there and how to run them on Kubernetes and recommendations. Some are more up to date than others. I've seen a couple that, probably should have expired 2-3 years ago that use API versions in their deployment examples that no longer are no longer supported, et cetera, et cetera. But it creates an interesting challenge. And that challenge is compounded by the fact that each of these CMS systems is obviously their own project, run by their own community, running with their own tech stack, whether it's the technology in use by the CMS or if it's the technology, of how they host their source files, whether it's Git or Mercurial or GitLab versus GitHub, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that we're in a unique position to address some of these challenges. Specifically, I think that we're in a position to where we can, at least as members of those communities, as well as this SIG, and as general ambassadors for development within the space, that we can address. So my proposal, it's multifaceted, but the first proposal that I think we need to do, and this would help a lot in focusing the efforts towards what we do to adopt, is we need to define a mission for ourselves. Now, obviously here I've got mission statement. That's great because that'll help other people that join the CMS SIG after this to kind of understand what our goals are. But beyond that, it's just actually identifying the mission, identifying how we're going to implement it, and going in that direction. I think we need to document our involvement with the CMSs. That generally means we need to create partnerships, identify people that are either part of both communities or somebody from one of the CMS communities that will work with us. Beyond that, I think it is quite likely and quite easy for us to create a resource package just to kind of address some of the main challenges. Most of these, let's face it, some of these CMSs like WordPress have been around for a while, and it becomes a little challenging to identify how to potentially update some things without breaking backwards compatibility. So it would be beneficial to create a resource package, some documentation and some guidelines for how to onboard these CMSs to easily onboard into Kubernetes. And then as a stretch goal, if we feel we have the time and if we can do something a little bit more serious, it might be beneficial to create a certification program to where we can give the end user or the CMS open source community a badge that says this runs on Kubernetes, that we know it runs on Kubernetes. We've done the work, we've done the development of the examples, we've done the documentation, and it's completely plausible. But this obviously doesn't go far enough as far as actually working on addressing some of those shortcomings I was mentioning earlier. This is great for us in this group, but I think the real power here is the partnerships with the other groups. So some of the areas I've identified for working with the CMS groups directly, where we could have a massive impact, for example, would be documentation. Now, when it comes to WordPress, and even I believe Drupal, there are some example documentations that Kubernetes itself hosts. But it would be good to create reference architecture. This is your service, this is your optional MySQL database, this is how you configure this is how you configure that. And then work with the CMS community itself to create documentation that can be integrated into their actual hosted documentation on how to run their system within Kubernetes. Beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, most of these projects don't maintain their own Docker containers. They're completely hands-off. They ship the software out, and then the Docker community, for example, will turn around and create the Docker image file and then go from there. But it may be beneficial, at least with some of these larger ones, if they actually host or if they actually create their own Docker files or other containerization technology build packs. Just working with that would allow them to have more control over what it is that they're actually publishing out there. I don't, again, I can't speak authoritatively here, but I would be rather upset if there was some kind of bug in, let's say, the WordPress official image, that now I'm having to go out and try to communicate with 3 different groups to identify where that bug comes from, how to resolve it, get it through the pull request process, and then get it out there. So I see there's some significant improvements in how that could work by just simply working with the open source projects themselves to say, look, we can contribute the files to you, but it would be beneficial if, as part of your own release cycle, if you could maintain and update these Docker images, and at least build some minor proficiency and understanding how your own system runs within your container. Of course, that leads directly into the other types of package management for Kubernetes specifically. Obviously, if a Docker image can exist, then it would be beneficial to have example deployments hosted within the open source projects themselves. So whether that's work that's done by us and then contributed, or by community members on their side, it would be beneficial to really working with those projects to get them their own Helm charts or their own deployment YAML manifests, and work with them to teach them about how to use Kustomize, for example, or any number of other different different tools out there. And then finally, I think the other major area where we're kind of light at the moment is advocacy. So as SIG members, we're kind of in this unique position that we care about how software runs on Kubernetes. We care about Kubernetes, but we don't necessarily do a good job at communicating some of the issues that we see, or even staying on top of some of the issues we see, to these projects themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, I've seen tickets that are 2-3 years old that have no popular support behind them, because they only impact a certain number of users, or in let's say in the case of WordPress, I may run WordPress off the official image, or I may just package it up myself, depending on my own level of capability. So some of these things, might be beneficial, just somebody going through and saying, hey, as part of the SIG, I'm also part of the Drupal community. I see tickets that are related to containerization specifically. Maybe I can address some of those issues. Maybe I can help, advocate for some of those issues to be prioritized and brought into the workflow. So that's kind of where I see us coming from, just aiding the projects themselves, whether it's in the form of advocacy, or whether it's in the form of, contributing documentation, or, guiding through some of the technological challenges of adopting Kubernetes, whether it's defining the architecture, defining the manifest, or saying, hey, this is how we package manage this, or here's how we use templates to make this possible, etc. But at the same time, I know that, as Kevin and I discussed this, I saw little glimmers of light in his eyes as well. So I believe that there are other potential ideas out there. This is really where I would, call on others to speak up and, bring up your own ideas. Today we'll be filing a ticket on the SIG's Git repository to kind of talk through this proposal in a open forum, and I'm not even sure what the right process would be to adopt it, but this would be the perfect time, and I'm inviting people to come out and actually make comments on that, give feedback, mention things that I forgot, mention the areas where I may have overshot. This is definitely one of those topics that's not going to go away. I mean, it's trying to define the core of what it is we're doing. So it's as much up to you as it is to me to define, hey, this is an area where I think we could do more. One of the examples I had here, something that I was kind of thinking about and pointing through earlier, is maybe it would be beneficial to get a list of plugins for the various CMSs like Drupal or WordPress that make it possible to run that CMS directly on Kubernetes. I'm thinking of things like, for example, uploading files to block storage or buckets rather than directly into the file system itself. So I'm completely open. If anybody has any ideas, please reach out. Please advocate for your thoughts. And that's all I'm asking for. That's all I've got.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for putting the time into presenting this for us, Shawn. I think it's pretty beneficial, and I generally appreciate the attempts to help structure this a little bit more. There's a lot of potential that we have as a community to be able to make some pretty profound changes, and I think that I personally have some opinions as to why some of the specific communities don't have a little bit more structure around this. But I'll leave those off of this call, or maybe leave them for another day. And as Shawn mentioned, we'll be creating some issues on GitHub to be able to talk about these ideas, to get this proposal out there. If you are so inclined, please take a look at it, and happy to receive any feedback that you might have. So moving forward with this particular meeting, since it is still a little early in the year, we're a little light on content. So typically what we do at this point is just kind of open it up to any recent challenges or celebrations that anybody from the group would like to share, any news that they've heard of in the community, that in the Kubernetes community or the Drupal community or any other CMS community that is exciting to them at this particular time.
Oh, I'm trying to think now.
I know some of the things that are very interesting to me right now are just kind of the progression of Helm 3. Helm presented a lot of good opportunity, or a lot of good potential. And I felt like it kind of fell apart a little bit coming out of version 2 and into version 3. So I personally haven't been keeping up with that enough, but that is one area that I do find intriguing at this particular time.
I think Shawn has worked with it a little bit more. I'm also in the curious phase. I have scars for life from Helm 2, and I agree. Like, the promise of Helm 2 is incredibly solid, and I think it was really ambitious and did a lot of great things. So I'm curious actually to see what Helm 3 is doing with the new architecture that they have.
I've worked with it quite a bit. Unfortunately, I think there's still some shortcomings in it. Probably not of a blocking nature like Helm 2's or Helm 1, Helm 2's tiller model. But I mean, there are definitely some challenges with some little rough edges and things like that. Unfortunately, where I see the real problem is the community support for Helm 3 is not as good as I would want it to be. And that's just coming from my own experience with Argo and then also with Terraform. It's building, but the plugin support for it, for example, with Terraform just doesn't exist yet, and it's taking them forever.
Yeah, Terraform I think I think that's driven a little bit more with HashiCorp.
Well, the big challenge is that the model is completely changed, right? So originally, this is true for Terraform. I don't know about others, but originally there were two approaches. One, you either rasterize the charts and completely ditch the, this is managed by Helm, this is installed through Tiller, so Tiller is aware of what's being installed, et cetera, et cetera. Or you actually manage Tiller as well, and the problem is Tiller is not part of this. The way that it stores that it's managed by Helm is different. Yeah. And even some of the rasterizing is a little bit different now.
Yeah, I will add this. I have been bitten enough by tools that do runtime rendering of manifests in like, especially like in a CI/CD pattern. I've generally really now tried to steer away from that. And the reason is it becomes a lot more difficult depending on how sophisticated your template is, or your templating tool is interpreting whatever your markup or whatever it is it's interpreting. It becomes then this big black box that does this very complicated stuff that depending on the tool then becomes very difficult to debug.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. I'm not gonna lie about that. It's been a challenge in the past, especially having written Helm charts. The WTF counter per minute is usually fairly high when you're doing that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a significant amount of promise still in bundling the entire project templates into something that can easily be modified. And I mean,
Yeah.
the problem really is it's six in one hand and half dozen in the other. It's the same challenge, just modified to what you as the end user are more, used to, what you're more comfortable with dealing with. So.
Yeah, and I think this is what appealed to me really about Kustomize, was it looks like especially the Kustomize V3 put a lot more emphasis on the ability to break things down and share them and reuse them across modules. The hub and spoke pattern. If you go to Kustomize's GitHub page and their examples, they have some good drawings actually that illustrate this, with the transformer pattern.
I think the biggest challenge here, and I mean, this is kind of at least where I kind of have issues, is it's not enough to know Helm. It's not enough to know Kustomize. It's not enough to know JSON. Every tool that comes into play, eventually you're going to run into, you're going to have to build some working knowledge on. And it really becomes a major challenge because over time, the different approaches, the different conventions, et cetera, they all run counter. So when you focus on one tool for too long, you completely forget what, customized specific stuff or, the Helm specific stuff that you've worked so hard at figuring out. So
Yeah.
I think that's really the big challenge. And this is, when we were in the container orchestration wars, and this was kind of the challenge we were addressing. This is why, Kubernetes or EKL or ECS or whatever else. Well, it's kind of in a place now to where I would like to see some kind of standardization, whether it's Helm or Kustomize or whatever else, where somebody just says, okay, from now on, this is going to be this. And, projects can contribute to this and make it better, but here's the approach.
Shawn, you bring up oh, I'm sorry, I thought you, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's just, at least from what I see.
Actually, that's a really good point that you bring up. And I think we're still in a bit of a rendering war when it comes to managing Kubernetes manifest without having to write just pure code to do it. The Kustomize is it seems like right now what the community is doing is that you have Helm 3 and Kustomize is really two competing projects. The Terraform module, I would say, I would put that as like a second tier, and that's not that I think that necessarily about Terraform. It's more in that's not like that's a module of a much greater scoped project.
Much agreed. I mean, the thing about it is, even with Helm and Kustomize, they're not technically competing projects. I look at Helm more like I looked at apt, and I look at Kustomize more as I look at, I don't know, command line tools like maybe awk and SED or something like that. The point of it being is that they all have different focuses, but it would be nice to see something that's cohesive across the entire board.
Yeah.
And we run the risk of, by advocating for that, we run the risk of having, like RPM and apt, having massive competition out there. But I just don't think it's properly solved at this point. I mean, there's no way of saying, look, I want WordPress, or I want MySQL and Memcached. Sure, Helm's got some charts there, although the efficiency and how long they've been maintained and how they're set up is kind of questionable for some of them. But again, it's a discussion about, how do we standardize the packaging of our applications where we're not running custom manifests for everything we're deploying?
I think this is where like operators were at least initially thought to maybe help solve this problem, in which you're at least the sheer volume of manifests that you're handling goes down significantly. I also do think that once customized plugins, like the ability to actually use them and develop them, matures more, and that it's very easy as long as you know how to write Go to do like a transformer plugin or a generator plugin is actually the bigger one. where you can codify that. If it's complex enough to where writing it in Go or in Python makes more sense, or it's more intuitive, the programming language fits, it's better suited to describe the solution to the problem you're trying to solve or what you're generating, then I think that's the way to go. And I think Helm has been trying to do that with the Lua support. But then the problem is they've chosen Lua. Now we got to learn Lua.
Well, come on.
Technologies.
Yeah, and if you're at all a gamer, surely you know Lua is a result of fun things like World of Warcraft, where it's just interesting that language is becoming more relevant.
Oddly enough, I learned a little bit of Lua when I was playing with a mod to Minecraft, where you can I was trying to automate the control of a nuclear reactor, actually.
Sounds like an appropriate use for Lua.
Definitely.
Cool.
As long as it triggered a scram, that's all you need.
Right. Okay. Well, we do want to stay a little bit on track here before we devolve too much.
Well, we got through the presentation. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks for that input from both of you. That was a really interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to seeing how Helm evolves. I think there's a lot of potential there, and I know that it's a very easy thing to stumble across and to pick up and to get started with, and suffers from a lot of the issues that other larger projects have, which are consistency around the recipes that are out there, around the ways that people use it specifically. So something to keep our eye on. Generally speaking, as we move forward, this is going to be a relatively short meeting. On February 12th, we have a gentleman named Nick Santamaria. I believe he's from Australia, but he might be from New Zealand, and I'm sure that I will receive slack from getting that confused. But he works on a project called Skipper, which is a very interesting approach at hosting with Kubernetes, and he's going to give us an overview of that. It's potentially possible that we will have Florian Loretten, I believe is how you pronounce his name, from Wonder. He's going to give us a session on migration from Helm 2 to Helm 3. So that seems like a pretty relevant topic today to today's conversation. We're still looking for a presenter for the February 26th meeting. So if anybody's available for that, please reach out in Slack or on GitHub, and we'll be happy to accommodate you. And then moving into April, so it looks like we still have a little bit of work to fill out March, but we have a gentleman named Brad Jones who is going to give a presentation on Cert Manager and Traefik 2.0, 2.x, I should say. So definitely keep an eye out because it looks like we do have some content starting to formulate that should be interesting to most folks. Again, thank you all for your time. Definitely appreciate the conversation. Keep an eye out on the Slack channels and on the GitHub repository for additional conversation about the proposal that Shawn's put forth today. And as always, I don't know, just keep having fun out there, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.